Good morning, dear colleagues, friends. Welcome all. We are already running about 10 minutes late. And as you know, this is only a 1-hour session, so we've already lost almost 20% of our time. So I would like to start right now. I know there will be stragglers coming in, but I want to thank you all for your presence here this morning at what promises to be a very interesting session. And this is precisely why my introductory remarks will be kept very, very brief. But before we get into the panel, allow me to, could we start with the video of Mr. Staffan de Mistura, who was the former Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and UN Special Envoy of the Secretary General to Syria. Can we begin with that, please? Does someone know how to operate this one?
Just press on the picture.
Sorry? There it is.
Thank you for having invited me to this important panel. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you, as you can see. I am in the region on my new current duties, which is Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the crisis in Syria. But I would like to contribute, because Syrian women are, in fact, taking enormous toll of what is the current conflict. Just look at the figures, and you can see how many women currently are part of this tragedy. Well, probably out of the 11 million people who are in real basic needs, there is at least 75% of them who are women and children. And we have got 2.7 million of children who don't attend school, neither inside or outside. And they are taking care of the household because many of them are left in charge of the household. And the food is going down. The wheat production has gone down substantially. It's 52% of what it used to be. And when you add on top of it the tragic and horrific results of the ISIS, i.e. Daesh, this terrorist organization which is now taking over an area as large as Jordan in the whole northern part of Iraq and Syria, you can imagine what type of pressure exists on them. That's why this panel is important, because it does remind me what has happened in Iraq, in Syria, in Dubrovnik, in the Balkans, when in fact women not only were the victims of the conflict most often, but they became also those who were most exposed because they were looking for food and they were trying to feed their own family. So good luck. I'm sure you will have a very fruitful panel, and next time I hope to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. de Mistura, for your introductory remarks. Friends, as you know, this is a session essentially on how we ensure food security, especially for women in situations of conflict, but also in situations of peace, where there is tremendous displacement and disruption. We have a very, very distinguished panel with us today, and I would prefer if we get down to the business of the day rather than to give a long, lengthy introduction on a subject which I'm sure you all know as much about as I do, if not more. So without further ado, let me invite our three panelists at this stage. We are still waiting for the third panelist to arrive, but we have a fourth speaker coming in later, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first two panelists whom we have here. Both of them are very distinguished, and to introduce them would probably take up most of the session, so I would not try to do an introduction. Instead, I will introduce them just before I invite them to speak. But what I would like to do is to pose a question. We have our third panelist here. Thank you very much. And basically what I would like to do is to pose questions to them, and they have a very limited time in which to answer these questions. The same questions will be posed to all three panelists, and we would then listen to their responses to these questions. They bring with them to this subject a very diverse experiences, and I think it will certainly enrich our understanding of the challenges which we face in this particular area. So the questions basically are: how do we reach displaced women and children, families with special food needs? How do we realize the human right to food in a situation of unpredictable displacement? That is the real challenge. The displacement may be due to conflict, but increasingly it is due to other factors, as you know. We have situations of drought, for example, which is causing tremendous internal, if not external, displacement. We also have natural disasters, and now we have, the very pressing problem of epidemics and people moving for fear of spread of epidemics and so on and so forth. So this is a major challenge. How do we reach such vulnerable people? How can we look at their needs, both short-term as well as longer-term, both obvious as well as less obvious, and what are the suggestions for addressing these gaps? This is the first question I would like to pose to our three panelists. The three panelists, as I said, are all very distinguished, so I will just introduce them by mentioning their current designations. Our first panelist is Dr. Ilaria Bottillero. She is from IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, which faces the Vatican on the other side of the city. And she's the Director for Research and Learning. Ilaria.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for joining this panel today. It is a real privilege to be here today. My organization, the International Development Law Organization, is the only international organization with a focused mandate on the rule of law. We're actually the only organization that do nothing else but look at the rule of law and how the rule of law can help development, and especially sustainable development. Our vision of the rule of law is quite broad. We don't see the rule of law only as rules, procedures, court systems, training of judges, training of lawyers, but we see the rule of law really as an enabler of sustainable development. And one of our focus areas of work is working with countries that are emerging from conflict, working with countries in fragile situations, working with countries that face difficulties in their governance structure. Within those countries, we take special care of the needs of women and the situation of women. And that's why I'm very, very pleased to be here today to talk about why is the law important for women. Even when we talk about food security, when we talk about food, we don't necessarily link the issue of food with laws, policies, regulations, and the like. But it is essential that for women to reach a situation of food security, there are laws and regulations and policies in place that allow them to do so. I brought some statistics talking about displaced women and children. It is very clear that, and research indicates that where families have been displaced because of conflicts or natural disasters, access to food and control of food are frequently used, for example, by soldiers or other providers as a bait to entice young girls and women into survival of sex. The question of transactional use of sex food increases levels and vulnerability to HIV, which in turn then exacerbates food insecurity cycle. It is also very widely recognized that due to food scarcity for themselves and their families, women in refugee camps are frequently forced to leave such camps to look for food, and that places them in danger of rape and sexual violence outside the camps. There is also quite strong evidence indicating that domestic violence may have increased as a result of protracted displacement. Women could be at risk from men who felt emasculated by camp life and the inability to provide for their families. For example, in Bangladesh, frustrations and the lack of space provoked very high levels of tension within refugee households. In Chad, we have evidence to show that domestic violence increased after distribution of food supplies because men who may have recently returned from the Central African Republic sought to control the use of food rations. Even in cases where gender-based violence does not directly coincide with food insecurity, it is true that food insecurity and gender-based violence actually reinforce each other. For example, women victims of gender-based violence may not leave an abusive relationship because of the fear that they may not be able to feed themselves or to feed their children. Talking about how the law, and going to your question, how can we reach these women, how can we reach children that are in more vulnerable situations? What we have learned at IDLO from a series of interventions in the field is that many times women's access to justice needs to be enhanced in order for women to find some form of remedy or some form of reparations when their rights have been breached. And the question is not very simple, because many times women's access to justice is not necessarily through the formal courts, but women access a variety of justice mechanisms. They may access informal justice settings, they may access the regular courts, they may access justice mechanisms that are in the middle, in between formal and informal. But we have learned that empowering women to access justice could be part of the solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ilaria. Without further ado, let me invite Stanley Samkange. Stanley also has a very distinguished career, but currently he is at the World Food Program as the Director of Policy, Program and Innovation. Stanley, please.
Thank you. And, well, for WFP, this is a very important subject, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk a little bit about it and to learn from you also about it. For us, all of our programming is required to be gender sensitive. We do this both at the review stage, but then we also do it at the implementation stage. And that's because fundamentally what we as an organization try to do is address that first question that you asked. How do you provide food assistance to people in difficult situations? Sometimes those difficult situations are the result of conflict. Sometimes they are just the result of poverty or general food insecurity, and other times they are the result of natural disasters. What's very clear to us is that there are fundamentally two ways in which we have to be careful about the assistance that we provide. One is just in how we provide that assistance. We have to be sure that at a minimum we minimize the risks that we put all of our beneficiaries in, but particularly women. And the second is particularly in situations of conflict or social violence, there are special considerations that have to be taken into account, both in the way that we provide assistance, but also in the targets of our assistance. In terms of the way we provide assistance, some of the considerations that we take into account, for example, are what type of assistance. Do you provide cash? Do you provide commodities? Do you provide vouchers? We have the ability to do all three, and each of those three modalities has a different impact on, or can have a different impact on gender-based violence and the position and role of women. And it's not just the threats to women and children in situations of conflict, but as Jomo said, it's also in relatively normal situations. You also have significant potential household and community threats to women, depending on how you provide that assistance. And we've learned that we can't take anything for granted, that in difficult situations, food is a very valuable commodity, and anytime you inject value into a difficult situation, you potentially put people at risk. So we're very careful and conscious about that. We're conscious about trying to ensure that we don't require people to walk long distances to get the assistance that we provide. We're very careful about the locations in which we make distributions to be sure that those are as safe as possible. And just, for example, even in normal situations in Uganda, if you use beans, traditionally women have control of beans as a food crop. If you use maize, men have control of maize. So when we're doing development programming, we're very conscious of the kind of commodities we buy, the emphasis that we make, because it makes a difference in control of the assets. Obviously, in situations of conflict, you have very special circumstances that arise, and that creates issues for us in terms of reaching people, but also issues for us in terms of some of the types of people that we are trying to reach may not be where you would normally expect them. If they're victims of sexual or other violence, maybe they may be in clinics or others, and we need to reach out to those types of organizations for women and children that, and make special efforts to provide assistance there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan Lake. I think it's relevant to emphasize that Stan Lake has been in the field. He was head of the WFP in Uganda and subsequently regional director for East and Central Africa, and he's a national of Zimbabwe. Our third speaker is Marta Benavides, who has also a long and distinguished career, but I think it is very apt to express our appreciation for her presence here today, because as you know, last night there was a very bad earthquake, 7.4 on the Richter scale of El Salvador. Marta Benavides, por favor. I should emphasize that she is a feminist theologian, and I thought that was the most interesting of all your many distinguished accomplishments. Thank you.
Buenos días. I kept thinking about these questions and how to talk with you about this, because, especially because I come from a country that is called the Valley of the Hammocks. You know, we have lots of earthquakes. So imagine the poets say, it's the Valley of the Hammocks. It's nothing so nice about being in a hammock to be in a quake, you know. And so we have had civil wars, and we have experienced the colonial and conquest experience too, you know, and so that creates very special conditions because it changes the history of the people, and especially those who are now considered to be in vulnerable conditions, and which we wrongly call people who are vulnerable. You know, communities and people, and in the case of women and children, are not necessarily vulnerable, but they are placed in vulnerable conditions because we are not paying attention to whatever are the situations that they have to face. What I have found is that the people that suffer these conditions are very, very resilient, and they really are very creative. And so it is there that we have to start to figure out the solutions to all the problems, because they have to face them, and they come with many solutions. Sometimes they are very short-sighted because of the conditions, but in all, we can see the creativity and how they really respond to not only, you know, figuring out how to survive, but how to figure to have a quality of life and the right to live. You know, we have a right to development. We have a right to self-determination. All these conditions have to be considered when we are looking at these particular situations. I was talking with some of the people before I came, and I was telling them that there were going to be people here talking about these issues, and with women, and they said, there is no irregular displacement. Any displacement, you know, really is really forced, and anyone be it that because of the impoverishment situation, like in Europe, there is a lot of displacement going on right now, and displacement can be also that you don't have a right to employment, and so you end up living with your parents if you are a young person, and what does that determine for your future? Food is not a commodity. Food is a human right. And therefore, how we look at it, we have to look at the frame of human right. A human right to life and a human right to food means that those things that determine that you have food when you need it and the kind of food that you need, it has to be considered from that perspective. Therefore, we believe that we have to start not with food security positions, but with a position of food sovereignty, which means that you have to look at the right of people to determine how you live, how you solve your problems, and how you make decisions about your life. So the UN has been going through the MDGs, figuring out how to go into the sustainable development processes. And when we talk about food sovereignty, food security, that is about sustainability, the ability of people to provide the sustenance of life, which is not just food, but the conditions that allow you to live and enjoy life. We believe that, therefore, this whole understanding about how do we solve the problems have to come also from the sustainability process. It's a peace issue. This is what the UN is about, to guarantee peace. Peace is about the enjoyment of life. And so we are requesting and asking people to look at these conditions and situations and how to look at the short and long-term solutions, not as false. We shouldn't be looking at false solutions. False solutions, for example, is to have food security that doesn't allow the sovereignty and dignity of people. And for there, the people that are put in the most vulnerable conditions have to be accompanied from the beginning, and it is right there that has to start.
Thank you very much, Marta. El Salvador is a particularly interesting society because we have had a peace agreement in place for many years, but unfortunately it all continues to have a very high level of violence in society, and this is part of the tragedy of violence and war, where in a sense practices continue during ostensible peace times. Now let me now change the program as we go, because I think it is very useful for us to be reminded about some of the challenges which we face in this area. And for this purpose, I would like to invite Lois Herman, who is the coordinator for the Women's UN Report Network, to make a brief presentation. She has 31 slides to share with us, but she assures me that she will go through them very, very promptly. So, Lois, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The Women's UN Report Network, WUNRUN, is based on a UN study. It addresses the human rights, oppression, and empowerment of women and girls all over the world. And the reason that my colleagues and I wanted to have this panel today is that we see many women falling through the cracks. So what I hope to do today is put faces on who are those women in the field who are suffering without adequate food and may not be documented. We know of the conflicts in some 32 countries. The women grab the children and may have to run instantly, and they may never know where the next food is going to come from. I have a few of the UN documents included, but again, in the interest of time, I will go through them quickly. You can see them. This is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We talked about the right to food, as Marta mentioned. Syria, where His Excellency de Mistura gave us this message. He is so busy, and yet he took the time to give us a powerful audio video as a testimonial to the importance of this panel. How can we reach the women and children who are on the run, who are not in refugee camps, who are not documented, and who are trying to survive. Take a look at this. I won't read through it, but just look at the words on the screen. This says a lot about why this panel is important. And when there is a sudden conflict, when you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear armed forces outside your door and you grab your children and run, who gets left behind? The displaced are also handicapped, elderly, sick. Not everybody can run. This is very painful for families to be broken in the midst of war and conflict, also natural disasters and climate change crisis. Israel and Palestine, the tensions continue. The definition of food security. We talk about it a lot. We talk about food sovereignty. What are the words that say it like it is? And it is a human right. It is to be enforced. But that's very hard to do in today's complex and volatile world. Historically, there are many memories of the same kind of struggle, a woman with a child on her back trying to get under a barbed wire fence in Zimbabwe. How does it feel? One Run presents a lot of research, a lot of academic papers, reports, but when you come to the core of the issue of food security in conflict, it comes down to feelings. How does it feel to be going through this terrible time and not be able to give your child water, milk, or food? Again, I'm going to go fast because of respect to my colleagues, but here we go, around the world. Syria, dying babies because they don't have enough food. And in some cases, you can't get the aid into them because of the conflict dimensions. For every starving child, there is a mother, hopefully alive, also hungry, likely poor, and in deep despair that she cannot provide her child with adequate food and nutrition for health and for survival. Intersectionality. You can't take food security and draw it out as a singular issue. It needs to be intersected with education, with health, with forced marriage, with land and housing, migration, trafficking, prostitution, and all the human rights issues that relate to the right to food. Gaza. This is a land-grabbing situation, also very much on the screen of the right to food and food security. Running in Somalia. For how many years? There are many internally and externally displaced women and children who don't show up in camps, don't get registered, maybe with family, maybe with friends, maybe moving around, and very hungry. Girl child soldiers, the comfort women, Ukraine on the headlines, Latin America, Yemen, and a poem. I'll leave that on the screen. I would love to be able to talk to you longer because I think you understand why we're here, what we're hoping for, and that these women and children in the field, in the conflict, in the crisis, and the disasters know that we care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lois. I was hoping that Hilal Elva, our other panelist, would be here by now, but unfortunately she isn't. I would like to have our panelists have an opportunity to respond to her as well as to you. And I think at this stage, rather than invite the panelists to speak again with another post question, I would urge you to make comments and raise questions briefly, if you can, please, so that we can then conclude with the panelists responding to the questions and making concluding remarks of their own. So if the panelists don't mind this change of format, I would like to invite all of you who would like to intervene at this stage to take the floor. I believe there is a microphone. Is there a microphone? Yes, sir. In the last row, yes, please. Please identify yourselves before you.
Hello.
Thank you.
I'm Chris To from World Food Program. Basically, I'd like to be a little more practical. Again, having served in government before joining WFP, many governments, especially those in developing countries, often face situations of limited resources where decisions have to be made. My question to the panelists would be whether it is in times of peace, whether it is in times of conflict, or whether it's given a health crisis as we are now witnessing in West Africa, where the majority of those who are dying are women because they are the caregivers, they are the health workers. My question would be, in which areas should we be investing for maximum impact to get the maximum result? Where should the focus be, especially in times where resources are very, very limited? And I give the example of Liberia. We started off government in 2006 with $80 million as the national budget. $80 million for almost 4 million people, for a country whose infrastructure, institutions, and system had been destroyed by war. Decisions had to be made. So we do recognize the importance of women, but the question is, where should we start to intervene for maximum results?
Thank you very much. The next, I'm sorry, I lost track of the hands earlier. Yes, lady.
Good morning. I'm Maria Hartl from IFAD. This morning on the radio I heard that another 180,000 people are displaced in Iraq. The numbers are just so overwhelming at the moment, and I would like to ask a question similar to the one that was made before. What would you actually think is the most important that we, working in these organizations, and these side events are an opportunity for us to listen to you and to bring together experts. What should we do faced with this overwhelming reality at the moment? I mean, for IFAD, of course, this is trying to build communities, to build resilience, but sometimes we think everything can be washed away in one armed conflict. So I would like to invite you to give us an answer what we should do.
Thank you very much. Was there a hand here? Yes, please. In the third row from the front, yes.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Madeleine Fogde, and I come from the Swedish International Agriculture Network Initiative. I have a specific question to Mr. Samkani in regards to cash transfers and food vouchers, and if you have made any studies on the impact it has on domestic violence, is this creating problems in the families? And usually they are distributed to women, but I guess based on a long experience working in the developing world, this can be conflictuous also. And I will also, a follow-up question is a little bit linked to nutrition. If you have also studied what kind of nutrition impact the food voucher has versus the cash transfers also. Because this is also an important part. It's not only food security. We want people to be nourished as well, even in conflicts.
Thank you very much. I thought I saw a fourth hand up earlier, but if there are no further comments or questions, let me invite the panelists to respond. We'll go in the same order, and I would invite you also to make any concluding remarks you would like to make. We don't have much time left, and I'm sure you will be as disciplined as you were in the first round. Thank you. Ilaria, per favore.
Thank you. Thank you, Jomo, and thank you for the questions. I don't think this panel can resolve necessarily the extremely important and difficult questions that have been posed. However, if you ask me which are the areas in which we should be investing, I would say invest in long-term structural changes that affect women. Food insecurity is not necessarily and exclusively the lack of food. When we're talking about women, food insecurity derives from an entrenched gender inequality. It's a question of discrimination. It's a question of power asymmetry. It's a question of lack of opportunities. It's a question of violence. It's a question of entrenched discrimination against women. So if you want to see long-term results, you have to empower women to be equal partners in society and to have a chance to perform equally as men in society. Your crops can be destroyed by natural disasters, your crops can be destroyed by war, people can be displaced by war, but when you invest in women's education, in women's empowerment, in women's access to justice, access to land, access to credit, access to resources, access to technology, access to financial assets, that's when you build the capacity of your people to react to displacement, war, violence, natural disasters, and that's when you see long-term results. So I would say invest in women, in the long-term growth of women.
We now have Hilal Elver, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. I would, rather than invite her to make intervention, since she has not followed what we have discussed thus far, I would like you to, Hilal, if you don't mind, to answer very. We've had an interesting discussion on how we realize the right to food in situations of conflict and displacement, and this is the challenge, and particularly for women, children and others who are most vulnerable in such situations. Can I ask very specifically, in your plan of work going forward as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, how you will be addressing this question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Sundaram, and I am extremely sorry to be late, but I had to be in another event, that's why. And I don't know, I'm sure it's a very valuable conversation already you went through. If something that I repeat, I apologize for this. First, the conflict situation is extremely important, especially recently. We thought that after Cold War we will not have any conflict. There is no East and West. There is no any kind of Cold War period, and the human rights will be implementable, and everything will be perfect. But it didn't work out that way. Now we are in the situation of a lot of areas, regions are in a kind of continuous conflict, not maybe always the big hot conflict, but internally and externally, and the neighbors are having a serious problem because of ethnic problem, religious problem, and resource conflicts. And if we look at the security studies areas, a lot of professors, a lot of academics are working on this issue, is the conflicts are part of the resource scarcity and the sharing the resources. And there are different views on that. Some of them, yes, they say that many of the conflicts are come from resource problems. In this sense, right to food and food security is part of the discussion of the reason of the conflict. But generally, it is not the subject that during the conflict what we have to do for maintaining, especially for women and children, their food security. This is something that recently started coming to the conversation, because especially region in the Middle East and Africa, a series of conflicts are going on, and there are refugees, there are displaced internally and externally displaced people, and many of them have lack of legal protection because many of the status of these people not legally protectable. This is a kind of issue. There's a certain kind of, let's say, legal gap, protection of women and children in times of conflict. Yes, we have this international humanitarian law principles, the Geneva Convention, we all know about it, but the Geneva Convention, at that period, the food security and the women and children, especially civilians, even protected by the Geneva Convention in a general principles, we need a specific protocol maybe to focusing on women and children in the conflict zone, because they are the most vulnerable victims and innocent victims, because man generally goes out to war and they deal with external issues, but the women stays in the conflict zone. And generally in the conflict zone, the food issue becomes kind of weapon to really destroy the societies. In this sense, we really need a kind of legal protection to make sure that during the armed conflict, that kind of situation should be seriously considered, and also maybe even part of the crimes against humanity. We should really think about this, because we never considered a kind of food security part of the crimes against humanity. Maybe it is time to do that, because if you look at recent, for instance, Sudan case or Syrian case, the conflict is becoming a kind of the food security and the food activity interrupted such a way that the impacts is longer and deeper. Of course, CFS, the Committee of Food Security, is in the process of discussing right now protracted crisis. It's an important document. And of course, conflicts are not only about armed conflicts, but there is also conflicts because of the natural resources and extreme weather event, and this kind of, especially extreme weather events, are not part of our concept of refugees. We have to really include right now new concept to the new developments of the world or new problems of the 21st century to make sure that especially vulnerables should be protected directly. Yes, indirect protection is there, but we need also direct protection. Coming to my report and priorities, one of my priorities is the protection protection of women and children, and dealing with the international humanitarian principles in times of conflict. Generally, as we know, there is a humanitarian aid in international conflict, but we have to be very careful about the international humanitarian aid, because this aid should be, first of all, culturally acceptable, and also should not be destroy the local market principles and the local people's lifestyle. Sometimes this kind of destruction and the period of conflict, the international aid comes and transforms the market, the local market, completely to a different thing. Maybe we really have to make the rule that this kind of aid should consider local producers, women and children, part of the production, not only the aid receiver. I think I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Elver. As you are in the company of two other lawyers here. Ilaria, on your immediate left, is from the International Development Law Organization, and Stan Lake as well is also a distinguished lawyer, although he gave up his law career for better things, I hope. So Stan Lake, without any further ado, let me invite you to make your responses and closing remarks, please.
Well, thank you. And maybe just quickly to answer the question from Sweden, but I think it's also a more general point. There is no one answer. So there are, the point is you have to look at each context, but you have to be sure to do that. Often we just make assumptions, but you have to be sure to do it. There are studies that show if you give women cash and a food in a particular situation, that you do put them at additional risk for domestic violence. We have studies that have shown that, but we also have studies that have shown that there is no effect. In other societies, other situations, you can do that safely. In fact, in some ways it may be a safer solution, because they can go to a market that may be close rather than go to a distribution point that may be farther away and then be robbed on the way back home. So the point is you just need to be sure you do the proper analysis and you have a gender-sensitive approach in whatever you do. And that's really, I think, my response also to the comments from our colleague from IFAD and to Chris Toh. Chris Toh, it's true, he's with WFP now, but he was the Minister of Agriculture in Liberia for some time. And so I think that's where that question was coming from. And my overall point is that we have to look at all of these issues in an inclusive way, not trying to take things in isolation, because when you press here, something else rises here. And just a quick example, I mean, it's very important, relevant points about how you protect people's food security in conflict. But if we look at the laws of war, as opposed to the humanitarian conventions, under the laws of war, it's better to conduct a siege than to obliterate a city. So you just carpet bomb a city, you obliterate everybody. That's prohibited under the laws of war, but the laws of war do in fact encourage you to conduct a siege, but the whole purpose of a siege is to starve people out. So as we try to bring these two things together, we always also have to be careful that we don't create incentives or issues in one part of a broad spectrum that then create other unexpected problems in another, because we're only looking at our particular area. So we need to be inclusive. We need to recognize, as we saw in the PowerPoint presentation, that all these things are connected, and that's the point of gender overall, that you can't just look at women without looking at the impact on men. Otherwise, you're going to do things here, and then you're going to see another consequence there.
Thank you very much, Stan Lake, for those very important comments. Donna Marta, por favor.
So coming back to where we left from all these perspectives, I think that what we are saying is that we really have to look for real solutions and not false solutions. For example, false solutions for us is to solving problems without taking into account all the aspects that we have been talking about. False solutions for us is, for example, saying that we are going to empower women. Women are powerful. This is like when we tell a little child, you know, you have to be this and study the other so you can be somebody. That was being said to a 9-year-old girl, you know, and she said, I thought I was somebody already. See, because the system creates conditions so that we are nobody unless we play with the system. And so we are being formed and shaped by the system as it is, which is, the system that is creating a lot of the problems, as we are saying. So I am encouraging us to really continue with this work. And so when we are doing the Millennium Development Goals, it was all about this, you know, eradication of poverty. Well, for that is really relating to health, you know, food and everything. But how we define each one of these is very important. So now the UN is working with the sustainability processes, and we have to be very mindful and paying attention and monitoring and making sure that our governments go there to do what needs to be done instead of just dialoguing and coming to conclusions that then later on it's not clear what they're going to be doing about it. She was talking about, you know, looking at food security, and in our case we are talking about food sovereignty as an issue of crimes against humanity. Well, young people in Latin America are saying that anything that is really doing harm to people and nature should be considered, and those that are involved in obstructing the processes and coming to the arrangements or the agreements that have to be about creating real development and therefore real security and real peace, we should consider taking those situations, those persons or countries that are creating those problems as crimes against humanity and therefore being tried in the International Criminal Court. So going from the MDGs to the Sustainable Development Goals and going then to what is really going, because this is the negotiations right now. We see that the important thing is we have a vast knowledge and conventions and all kinds of things. How do we implement them in the ground? This is what the UN is calling the second dialogues. I don't know if many of you know about it because it's being said and very quietly and it's happening in some countries, but it's not really something that we have been working as extensively as the MDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals that are being negotiated right now. Localizing it, territorializing it is how we are talking about. It has to be implemented in the ground, very intentionally, and with committees that involve everybody so that they understand, they know all this information and all these processes and agreements so they see how are they really happening in your community, in your home. And so I think that this part of territorializing it, making sure that it's in the locality that it happens, it has to be the measure of how good we are about peace and real development and therefore real security. And I urge you to pay attention to these things because that's the real investment, that it happens right on the ground. And then we will be able to look at the conditions that are really being faced by everybody at the community level and then take those experiences with all the vast knowledge and, the frames of human rights and legal situations to the top. It has to go from the local to the global and the global to the local. And that is very, very important. And we urge the industrialized nations and the citizens from those nations especially look at that.
Thank you very much, Donna Marta, for those very inspiring words. I think it's a very fitting conclusion to what was really a very good panel, and thank you all from the panel. However, I would like to invite Maris Gavino, who was very instrumental in putting together all this, to make some concluding remarks. As she walks over, you're going to do it from there?
Yeah,
come,
from here.
Okay.
No, very quickly. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And thank you very much, our distinguished panelists and friends and helpers who made it possible to